Welcome to another episode of What Are You Reading? What Are You Writing? I'm your host, Karen E. Osborne, and thank you. Thank you so much for coming and watching us and listening to us, whether this is your first time because you're so interested and you love Jeff and you really want to hear what he has to say, or you're a drop-in every now and then, or you're a regular. I'm grateful for whatever it is. We're so glad that you're here. And I do want to introduce you to this fascinating man. So his name is Jeffrey James Higgins. Hey, Jeff.
Hey, Karen. Thanks for having me.
I am so glad that you're here. So let me tell you a little bit about him. Like, he just wowed me on paper. We'll see how he does, though, here.
It's a lot of pressure, Karen.
Yes,
I don't know
indeed.
about that.
So he is a retired supervisory special agent who writes thrillers, short stories, creative nonfiction, and essays. Now listen to this. He has wrestled a suicide bomber, fought the Taliban in combat, and chased terrorists across 5 continents. He received the Attorney General's Award for Exceptional Heroism and the DEA Award of Valor. Jeff is a #1 Amazon bestseller and has won numerous literary awards, including the PenCraft Best Fiction Book of 2021 for his novel, Furious. This is so cool. So let's start there. Tell us a little bit about your career as a special agent.
Yeah, it was strange that I was even a special agent, Karen. I grew up knowing I wanted to be an author, probably like you and so many other writers. It's just in our blood from the time I was 5 and 6 writing. I went to journalism school for my undergrad. I worked as a reporter for a while, and I was between reporter jobs, and I was just waiting for the slot to open up. And I saw an ad for a private investigator, and I was like, you know what? I was a big Robert Parker fan, the Spencer for Hire series. I'm like, what a cool way to get some fodder for my book. So I worked as a private investigator for a couple different firms and was sort of exposed to a whole different group of people. People that I hadn't been in school with, people who wanted to be cops or people who wanted to get into the military or anything. And I really became sort of enthralled with it, and I read a lot about it. And I became a deputy sheriff at the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office down in Tampa, Florida. And had a really exciting time. There's something about being a cop where you're, day to day, you're actually helping people. You're saving lives. You're fighting for your life. You're getting into shootings. Like it was a wild time. And I became a special agent after that. And I ended up spending the bulk of my career doing narco terrorism. So I spent the first few years in New York, and I was doing like racketeering cases and going after like Colombian hit crews and people who are doing kidnappings. I always focus on the violence as opposed to the drugs. Being libertarian, the violence I feel is more important than the drugs themselves. And then I worked in New York for a couple of years, and 9/11 happened, and everything just sort of shifted for me and for a lot of your listeners, I'm sure. And the only thing I cared about from that point on was combating terrorism. So I was in the Department of Homeland Security's Watch Center for a while as a DEA liaison. I was actually one of the first people at the World Trade Center after the North Tower came down. It was myself and a Suffolk County detective and an NYPD officer, and the three of us were the first people to arrive. So I was carrying bodies out of the rubble, so it had a real impact in my life from that point on. And I was trying to find ways to get involved. I worked on the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which is an FBI task force in New York. It was Operation Pent Bomb, where we were investigating the hijacking and looking for. At that point we didn't know if there were other attacks going on. So I did that for months, and then I went and I ended up getting the DA said to open up an office in Kabul, Afghanistan. So I volunteered for that. Lucky me, yeah. But I really wanted it. So I was one of 2 people who went and opened up that office. And they had 2 temporary agents who were there. Then myself and another agent were the first 2. So I was the assistant country attaché in Afghanistan for like 15 months or something. I was there just working around the clock. I did the first undercover. I like you mentioned, I'd wrestled a suicide bomber who was in a terror cell that we'd been investigating. Just had a really, really unique experiences. And then DEA, in response to working in like these austere environments like Afghanistan, formed these international tactical teams. So called the FAST teams. So I joined these FAST teams, and we mentored and helped create a national interdiction unit, which was a team of Afghan cops. And we were able, it was a paramilitary force. So we were able to fly around the country and basically exert government power in these provinces where the Taliban were in control. And, you know, I did operations with the SEALs. I was embedded with special forces. We were doing operations together. You know, so I was in combat. It was a very interesting experience. And during that time, I actually arrested and convicted the first narco terrorist ever. The Congress passed a law based on the intelligence we've been developing about narco terrorism, which is, you know, the nexus between drugs, and terrorism. Most people don't realize that about at least 46% of all the world's terrorist groups are funded by drugs, by illicit narco.
Like the poppy fields and stuff in
Yeah,
Afghanistan.
yeah, and really the heroin. Afghanistan produces about 90% of the world's heroin. You know,
Wow.
so even though there's been a shift to opiates, like you see a lot of stuff coming out of China, like fentanyl, obviously is a big deal in the U.S. But opioids, that's fentanyl, but opiates, right? Like heroin are come out of Afghanistan. And so it really was feeding the world. And these, so the highest concentration of drug organizations in the world are in that area in Southwest Asia. So obviously they're using drugs to finance themselves. So that's what I did for a bunch of years. And then DEA formed these narco terrorism groups. So I came back to the US and I traveled around the world going after high value targets, going after terrorists that were, you know, literally everywhere. I'm not 5 continents, right? And we put together prosecutable cases against them and then extradite terrorists back to the US and we prosecute them here. So like one of the ones cases I was involved with was Haji Bacho, who was the world's biggest heroin trafficker. He was responsible for 19.7% of the world's heroin. So this is massive, you know, and he was a Taliban affiliate. So he was funding the Taliban separately. So, you know, it was a really interesting career. I went from wanting to be a
Yeah.
reporter to running around the world, jumping out of helicopters and shooting at bad guys. So, you know, as a thriller
Wow.
writer, it's about the best base you can have.
Yes, it gives you a lot of fodder, a
Oh
whole
my
lot of
goodness. Yes,
fodder.
it does.
Wow. And I did want to ask you, so being one of the first responders at 9/11, so many people's health, so many of our first responders' health got negatively impacted because of all the dust and everything that was happening. Are you healthy? Are you okay?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, luckily, I mean, so many people aren't, right? A lot of people have died from what they inhaled. There's heavy
Yes.
metals in the dust. I mean, these buildings just basically evaporated, right? They just
Yeah.
crumbled. And yeah, when I was down there for probably 6 or 7 hours right after the tower came down. And then the agents were called back to our office. So I went back thinking we get some kind of response together. When I came back, I looked like a snowman. Like I was just completely covered with white dust, you know. So I went down several other days and dug through the rubble and was on the lines of pulling evidence and body parts and things out of the rubble. But I didn't spend as much time as some of the other responders, like
So it didn't
some of the
affect you.
NYPD guys, right? And they were
Yeah.
there for months, you know. And I
Mm.
obviously the longer your exposure to that kind of stuff, the worse. But yeah, no, fortunately, I seem to get out of it okay. But I guess time will tell.
Yeah. Wow. Oh my goodness. So we want to know how you got from there. Like you always wanted to write.
Yes.
You you did all of these incredible things. Tell us about your writing journey. I noticed like you published short pieces. You sort of were building up to a novel in terms of the length of your pieces. Just share that writing journey with us. And did any of it overlap with your work as an agent? You know, were you writing when you were working, or did you wait till the end? Tell us about that journey.
So I was basically waited to the end because I had a top secret SCI clearance, which is the highest clearance. So everything I published had to get vetted and everything. But I was also a elected official in DC. I was a commissioner, ANC commissioner for the last like year and a half or so that I was on the job. So I had a position where I was a supervisory special agent and I ran a domestic group right at the end of my career. So I did publish one op-ed before I retired. And then I wrote a series of like essays, you know, and I wanted to write my whole life. I mean, I'm sure we all feel this, right? You have all these stories you want to get out. It never occurred to me not to do that. That was always my ambition. So I wrote, you know, I wrote a lot. I've written a tremendous amount of work. So I retired in 2017. and I started with like, narrative nonfiction. So I was writing about my grandfather, I was writing about, like more literary stuff, like going back to my childhood home and things like that. And I won an award, and I got into a few literary magazines, and so that was sort of the beginning. And then essays that I was writing about, like my specialty, right, about narco-terrorism, about terrorism, about law enforcement in general. So I've written for newspapers and things like that, and websites. And so and then I started to write a nonfiction book, which still hasn't sold yet, but I'm confident it will, which is about the very first narco-terrorism case. So that was my kind of my first thing. And then I wanted to write fiction my whole life, so I said, just enough of that. Time to start writing novels. I'm a thriller reader first, right? Like since I was a kid, like I love adventure, I love thrillers and mysteries and things. So I was like, let me just start writing that. So I wrote one book in 2017 and another at the end of 2017 into 2018, and I just kept going. I think I've written 8 or 9 books since I started.
Wow, that's amazing. That's wonderful. So Furious is your newest book that came out last year, is that right?
It came out last year in May of 2021. That was my debut. I'd written a nonfiction which hasn't been published yet, and then I actually wrote a book after it. I'd started it before and then finished it after, and that was published by Black Rose Writing in August of 2021. So I had 2 published last year.
Wow, that's excellent. So tell us, I'm very intrigued about Furious. I was reading, reading up about it, and it's such an interesting setting and premise. So tell us about the premise of Furious, and then after that, I want to hear more about your protagonist. But let's start with the premise.
So the premise is a woman loses her child. This is how the book opens up. So she's depressed after the loss of a child, and she's at that having that kind of existential, angst. What's life about? Do I, survivor guilt? What did I do something to cause this? How can I go on? Type of thing. The man she'd married and had the baby with, she'd married because of the pregnancy. So now she's with this guy she wasn't sure she would have married in the first place. She didn't know him that well, and now she's lost her child. So how can she get back to her internship? She's a doctor, so she's a surgeon. So she's sort of at the end of her internship, and she needs Austin, get her away from everything, change her surroundings, and just sort of help her get back to life. So the beginning of the book is her, she's scared of the water. She's on this boat, this Oceanus, this gorgeous boat, by the way. It's a 62-foot sailing vessel, just beautiful. And I've been on it, and I've sailed the 54-foot version of it. It's really cool. So she's out there sailing with him, and really the premise of the book is sort of like, okay, now she's starting to feel better about herself, but there's all these dangers, So in what form, you really don't know what form the danger will come in. Something that somebody else who's out there at sea? Is it her husband with these anger issues? Is it the sea itself, or is it something else? And so that's sort of the build up to it. Then once you realize what the real threat is, then the book just sort of races downhill to the end, to the conclusion.
Yeah, wow. And so you told us that she's sad and she lost her child, and she's trying to heal. Is there anything else about her character that would be interesting for us to know?
But I think it's a lot about self-reliance. Sometimes these themes, when you're writing them, you don't necessarily know the theme, but it comes out through the story. But it's about overcoming obstacles. It's about being true to yourself. It's about understanding
Mm,
what life is really like. And you mentioned my experience. I've been in numerous situations where I thought there's a very good chance I'm about to die. And when you have those moments, you realize how much you actually want to hang on to life, right? And you realize how
mm,
important it is, and it's just an instinctual thing that we all have. So when she's faced with this crucible, she starts to realize that she really does want to
I really
live,
want
and
to live.
she's been through a lot. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's
Wow.
something a lot of us can relate to. And by the way, that's why we read too, right? Because you can go
Yes.
through these experiences without actually being in mortal jeopardy.
Yes, exactly. And you can reflect, and you can
Right.
reflect. So, when you were writing Furious and the other book, what was the name of the other book that
The other
came
book was Unseen. That's a crime thriller, so it's very different. Actually, it's
out?
based on a real world terrorist conspiracy. My wife's an
Mm,
expert in the Muslim Brotherhood and in international terrorism, so that I relied on that quite a bit for that book. So it's got a real plot at the heart of it. but it's crime fiction. It's a vigilante type crime fiction.
Oh, wow. So what was the hardest part of actually when you said to yourself, just do it. You want to write fiction, just get going. Did you run into any challenges? What was
Oh
the
no, no, perfectly easy. Just says simple to write, easy to get through the books, simple to get published. Yeah, no problems at all. But thanks for asking. Yeah, no, of course. I mean, so even though I always, as part of my identity, was always an author, right? I always just knew I was a writer at heart, like a lot of us. You have to learn the skill, right? You have to learn the craft. And so I still do it. I think I just finished in the last couple months. I've read 3 or 4 books on writing. So I read a lot. I watch a lot of podcasts. I go to conferences. I've taken courses and master classes and all that kind of thing. And it just takes a long time. Like when we first write, hopefully you're always getting better. But if I go, like even now, I'll write something. And then when I go back, I'll be like, oh, what was I doing there? When I'm going through the 70 iterations of editing. But I mean, honestly, the beginning stuff, it just lots of rookie mistakes, and the only way to do that, to get over that is, to learn the craft. And the classes are great and reading about it's great. But you have to write, what's Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours to attain mastery in any field. It's like 1,000,000 words as a writer, right? You want to get to that 1,000,000 word mark to really become a master at it. But it's also about, I have a great critique group with some really talented writers in it. I have a dozen beta readers that I use for my books. So people who know who know the specific subgenre, or like definitely readers of the genre. But like the book that I just finished, which I'm hoping to find a new agent with, is about artificial intelligence. So like one of my beta readers is the CEO of an AI company. So people with like specific knowledge for each book is always helpful. But mostly I want readers. So you get tons of feedback from that, and you're able to improve as you go. And I found that my writing certainly is better now than it was when I first started. So a first draft 5 years ago was awful, and now my first drafts really aren't that bad, even though they need lots of work still. So yeah,
Yes.
learning the craft is hard, and then, by the way, learning the business of it is a whole other
Yes.
thing. You have to
Whole
learn that too.
other whole other problem. I remember the first person that I asked that wasn't a close family friend to read my very first draft of my very first novel. And she sat next to me and she said, "Oh, this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this made me crazy. And you can't. And I remember, and I was a grown woman because I didn't come to this until later in my life. And I could feel my eyes filling up. And I remember just saying to her, "Did you like anything? Did you like anything about it?" But you got to put yourself out there and learn your craft and get that feedback. I'm with you on that.
When you're a writer, you have the story in your head, and so what it is. So when you're putting it down, you don't always convey everything exactly as you're imagining it, right? So you need that third party to come in and take a look at it. You need to see objectively what's right and what's wrong. But there's also a skill to critiquing, right? I believe in the critique sandwich, where you tell them something you liked about it, then you give them something wrong, then you tell them something else again that you like. Just sort of, I mean, listen, we're artists, right? Anyone who creates something out of whole cloth is an artist, and we're creating this stuff, and it's personal, and a lot of what it's all the characters are you, right? They've all come out of your head, all the situations.
And
Sometimes
you
they're based
love
in
them.
real life. So you're emotionally connected. So there's a way to give criticism, which I was terrible at the beginning, and now having been in a critique group for many years, and I'm always beta reading and things like that. There's a way to do it, which is better, but you have to.
Yes.
Toughen your skin. And by the way, also understand it doesn't mean the criticism is right. I have
Correct.
15 people in my critique group, and usually if 3 or 4 of them point out the same problem, then I'm like, okay, that's enough people that I have to fix this. But
Yeah.
sometimes, people will say the opposite. Oh, I love this. I didn't like this. And they'll tell you why. And then you have to go with your gut. Sometimes one person points out a problem and I go with it because it just makes sense to
It
me.
made sense to you. It made sense to you. Exactly right. So this show is called What Are You Reading? What Are You Writing? So we have to talk about reading. So
Okay.
can you
I
have
love to
any,
read.
so do you have any, maybe 1 or 2 recommendations?
I read about 70 books a year. So I mean, I'm constantly, I do it on Audible, I've got something on the Kindle and I've got books next, so I'm just reading all the time. And I like to read a variety of things. Like my favorite has always been thrillers, action, adventure, mysteries, right? That's what I like the most. But about every third book I read a nonfiction. I try to read something literary. I try to go back and read a classic. So out of those 70-ish books a year I read, there's a mixture. Right now I'm about three-quarters of the way through The Marsh King's Daughter. It's Karen Dion. And I met her at Thriller Fest a few months ago, and she's the nicest person. I heard these agents and people just gushing about her work, and so I was like, I was chatting with her at a cocktail party, and she seemed so nice. I'm like, okay, I'll get her book, and it's amazing. Like I want to get The Marsh King's Daughter. Yeah, it came out a couple years ago, and I believe they're making it into a movie. I think it says that on the cover, but it's really well done. And sort of like Furious, a lot of it is this woman who's mostly alone. So you have to balance the backstory with with her internal thoughts. And when you're alone or when you're in a closed setting, it makes it a lot harder. And she does a really masterful job. I mean, she does way more backstory than I do, but it works. She pulls it off, and it's really terrific. You said I get two, so I'll give.
Yeah,
I've
go
also
ahead. Go
I'd
for it.
never read Tess Gerritsen until this year, or within the last 6 months or something. And I think I've read 5 or 6 of her books now. She's just a master. Oh my god! If you like I like medical thrillers, and that's kind of what she started with. And she does the Isles and Isles and Rizzoli, something like
Oh,
that.
yeah, yeah.
It's a crime series based on there's one of the characters is like a coroner or something. But I've only read one of those, but I've read like all her standalone stuff, and it's really terrific. Like she gets pacing. It's nice when you can relax when you're reading a book and just sort of put yourself in the hands of
Trust.
of a craftsman. And
Yes.
she does a great job. So big fan of hers. So those are 2 books this year that I've been reading that I really enjoy.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I could talk to you for another half hour, but
I know, me
unfortunately,
too.
our time is up. I want to thank all of you for being with us, and I'd like you to know how to find Jeffrey James Higgins. Where can all these good people find you?
Mostly in my office writing. My website is jeffreyjameshiggins.com. It's JEFFREY, James Higgins. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm kind of all over. I have Instagram, which I don't do too much. So I'm sort of all over the place. But go to my website. I have a newsletter, which is supposed to come out every couple of months, but I'm kind of lazy with that, so I'm a little late. But I throw out updates about appearances and things. Like I'll be at Killer Nashville in a couple of weeks, and I'm doing book signings and things there. So if anyone's in Nashville, come by and see me.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank all of you for being with us. You know that you can find me and all those places that you can find Jeffrey, all of those online places. I'm KarenEOsborne.com, and I look forward to seeing you next time on What Are You Reading? What Are You Writing?